Hello, everyone. My name is Samuel David Spoonhour. I'm very honored to have you today. I am kind of welcoming you to the Samuel Spoonhour channel. This is really just me giving out philosophy. I'm not a professional at all. I've just learned some things from other Christians, atheists, and just different philosophers, and also especially reading my Bible. That's taught me a lot. But this is not directly associated with the gospel call or with First Baptist Church. It is technically collaborative, so it is connected in a way. But if I say anything that is different theologically or philosophically than, say, my dad when he is preaching, or my brother when he is preaching, or any of our guest preachers, or anything that I say or anyone else says on the gospel call, it's of no effect. This is more or less independent in terms of ideology, philosophy, and theology. The whole point of this is really to give people something to think about. I am just doing this kind of uncut. If you find these videos entertaining, I am very, very grateful. That's kind of the purpose of this. I'm just going to give you some thoughts that I had on my mind. Hopefully it'll be just about a half an hour each video. And you guys leave some comments down below. If you agree or disagree, I promise you will probably disagree 90% of the time. But I can't promise you I'll actually get to all of those agreements or disagreements. So have some patience with me. I'm just trying to get some videos out consistently. This is supposed to be like a weekly post. I hope that you all enjoy. All right, so this is the very first video of my new podcast that I'm doing. It's just Christian philosophy with Samuel Spoonhour, or just Samuel Spoonhour. I have always wanted to kind of have my own philosophy channel. Whenever I watched Alex O'Connor, I can't remember the first time I actually watched him, but ultimately I just would listen to him and be like, yeah. And I'm just like, I want to do that on a channel because it's a good way for me to get my thoughts out. I hope that you guys actually appreciate it and maybe gets you to think in some ways. You guys can honestly try to have some discussion. I always appreciate friendly discussion as well. It's difficult because my life is extremely busy, and oftentimes replying to comments and trying to focus on those comments really wastes a lot of that time. Not that I don't care about people. I do. And I do want to reach you, but the gospel call is really going to be for like evangelistic purposes and more apologetics. This is more philosophy. But if you want to have a discussion, you could just kind of leave a comment below. This is all like really chill, really relaxed philosophy. So even if I do have a conversation, it's not really going to be debate worthy. That's not the goal of this. But I will say that maybe things might change in the future. Don't know. For now, these videos are just going to be kind of boring. But I hope that I hope that everyone gets something from this. I was reading my ESV. I especially love the ESV. It is my favorite Bible translation, English Standard Version. I personally think it's the most accurate. I could be wrong, which I might be. But I would say in the sense of it's the best translation to date. It's not really fair because it's one of the newest ones. It's 2001, I believe. I know that mine, and of course this from Crossway. I have an archaeological study Bible. Yep, 2001 ESV. The text edition is 2016 that I have. They recently came out with the 2025. I do not have one of those. But so this is a little interesting. I wanted to talk about the book of Genesis, actually, because I was going to Habakkuk. We'll go there soon. Because I just wanted to give some evidence for a point that I want to make. I'm going to look at some facts, or at least what I truly believe to be facts, and then just give philosophy based upon that. So kind of what I'm really looking at here is, I'm going to keep hitting this wire a billion times. So sorry if that comes through headphones. But I want to look at really just how God argues in a very interesting sense in the Bible itself. Because I think, in my opinion, And now, hopefully, I don't become eisegetical with this, because you always want to try your best not to commit that. But I truly believe that God talks to each person and culture according to what is best for them, in a sense, like what in the best way that they would understand. I think the Bible really shows that. Honestly, I think this is extremely obvious. It's really kind of hard to miss this. But of course, some people might disagree. And even so, I wanted to also talk about some things that most pastors don't. It's kind of some new research. I don't know how new. Again, I have an archaeological study Bible. This is from archaeologists, and they have opinions. They're very opinionated. It's kind of interesting because you'd think that the archaeologists wouldn't be so opinionated, but they're actually more opinionated, I would say, than even some pastors that will write their stuff in here. But they also give some very, very good information. So I'm in Genesis chapter 1, and I think I'm not necessarily going to read much of this. I'm going to read some of this, but hopefully you know this chapter. So it starts out very plain and simple. In chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. It's interesting to read that in ESV because it's almost the same in King James. Most of the Old Testament is. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Now, in one of the notes that is given here from the translators, I think this is important. Some commentators argue that this Hebrew word, which is deep, D-E-E-P, or the Hebrew word is tehom, I doubt I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a remnant of Mesopotamian cosmology related to the Akkadian word Tiamat, and of course some commentators argue this, the name of the goddess of the sea who battled the creator god Marduk. Marduk vanquished Tiamat in order to create the universe out of her body. Yeah, that's weird. These scholars conclude that the Lord also had to conquer the chaos god Tiamat in the form of the deep. This connection is dubious on a number of levels. Foremost, the relationship between Tehom and Tiamat is lexically uncertain, so it's not really for sure. I mean, uncertain really explains that. The Hebrews understood the deep simply as a primal world, ocean, and did not defy it. Waters. Now, the word waters played an important role in ancient Near East accounts of creation. For example, in the Memphite theology from Egypt, the creator god Ptah is pictured as using the primordial waters as a material basis of creation. In the Mesopotamian text, called the Enuma Elish, the waters are the source of life. The opening lines of the text describe a watery chaos consisting of three deities: Apsu, god of sweet water; Tiamat, goddess of the sea; and Mumu, god of the mist. It is out of the waters of these gods that creation emerges. In Genesis 1, water is no deity, but a mere element of creation. Now, this is their note. When they say, some commenters argue that that's just for deep, some are kind of arguing that is, I think it's called a polemic, but just an argument against that specific god, Marduk, or I guess it's like related in a sense, almost like borrowing. I don't know if that is what they're trying to say, that some commentators argue that. I'm guessing they would be more liberal scholars, because I know more conservative scholars wouldn't necessarily say that. But I would kind of agree at the connection between God taking... let me just reread this. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. That's clearly a state of disorder. It's not necessarily chaos. In these ancient Near East accounts, there is kind of this sense of chaos with water. There's some other notes that these archaeologists give. I know some scholars have noted that, like, in fact, you get this reference in the Psalms a lot, actually, where David will talk about how God is a shelter for him in the storm. The storm is like related to like a trying time in life. And so this this account really in Genesis, now don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying that Genesis is just poetry. I think it is metaphorical, but it's not just metaphorical. That's not saying it's only literal. But this does ultimately lead to that the purpose of Genesis chapter 1 is arguing against something, because it is not by itself. It's interesting because it assumes a lot of things. Genesis chapter 1 assumes many things of the person reading it. I don't think that we today understand it near as well as the Jews did when they first read this, when given this by Moses. When they first read this account, they had just come out of Egypt. Now, think about that for a second, okay? They followed these gods. In fact, God in Exodus had to command them to give up those idols and to stop worshiping those gods and only worship him. He had to, I'm fairly certain he had to say that multiple times because it was really a continuous problem. And also they would, of course, constantly stray. They created that golden calf with Aaron. Aaron helped them, and they just went to worship that. But this is interesting because what you have is you have God arguing, almost like arguing against these gods by taking chaos and organizing it. And this is really something else. I want to kind of reinforce this. I want to give really lots of good evidence for this. There's a large note here. I'm going to just read part of this, but this also gives some more to my argument here. Creation accounts were commonly found in the literature of the pagan cultures of the ancient Near East, and some of them contain divergent narratives with common motifs. For example, all of the mythic creation stories of the Levant were polytheistic. A plurality of gods took part in the cosmic drama, and all these gods personified various elements of nature. Thus, one of the primary creator gods of Egypt was Ra, who was identified with the sun. In Mesopotamian cosmogony, Tiamat was the goddess of the sea and played an important role in creation. Creation myths were centered on the gods and often had the purpose of elevating and exalting a particular god to the head of the pantheon. The Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, we just talked about that, for example, was written to explain why Marduk became the major god in the Hall of Gods. That I know for a fact that Marduk is the head of all the gods, or the Lord gods, the Lord God, or like the god of the gods in Babylon. In fact, from my understanding, from what I remember, Nebuchadnezzar is actually named after Marduk, but I could have that wrong. I would look that up. The gods themselves existed either through self-creation or through creation by other gods, called theogony. Thus, in some Egyptian creation myths, the creator god produced 4 deific children who became the material source of the universe. Shu, god of the air; Tefnut, god of the atmosphere; Geb, god of the earth; and Nut, goddess of the heavens. They in turn bred another generation of gods who represented other elements of the cosmos, such as Seth, god of the storms. The gods use various means in creation. The Enuma Elish describes a cosmic battle in which the deific forces of order vanquished the deific forces of chaos. Egyptian texts portrayed the various gods of creation as creating in various ways. One myth has its creator spitting forth other gods. Another has its creator forming gods through, I will not read that word. And yet another has its creator god forming the gods by naming its own body parts. So That is so interesting and wild. I actually forgot some of that, but I did know the one thing. I'm not going to read it, but essentially it's just self intercourse, even though that's not technically possible. But I think you guys get what I mean. So these accounts kind of refer to these, I guess not accounts, but really they are these legends, these myths, with the purpose of putting the one God at the top. So what do you have in Genesis then? You have something completely different. You don't have God fighting other gods or creating other gods. Instead, he creates the heavens and the earth. He creates all that is there, and then he creates human beings. And he's the one on the top from the beginning, even before the beginning, he's the one on the top. I think that really relates to when God says to Moses, he says, I've never said this name before to anyone, but I never revealed myself with this name. I am that I am, Ehiyah Ser Ehiyah. And then he says his name, which is Yahweh, which means self-existent one. Now, if you say I am that I am, it just essentially means you're independent. You exist in and of yourself. You don't need anything else to exist. Now, that is a very big claim. That's not to say that God actually exists. I'm not at all arguing from this that God exists. I, of course, believe that God exists, but the point of this really is that God here in this instance is using this account of Genesis to talk about all the different things, all the materials. He's taking them and he's fashioning them. Like he creates them, first of all, in disarray, and then he takes all of that disarray and he organizes it. He organizes everything, and he ultimately creates the entire world, the entire universe, and humankind, and of course, animals and plants. And he allows them then to live in this world because of the order that he has brought. And what does he say? He says it is good once he's done, right? It essentially is going from evil or what is not good to something that is good, right? It now has essentially his touch. I guess it's really the artister's touch here. And this also relates to the argument that you see God in creation. But really, I'm just going to focus on that Genesis is, in fact, an argument against these other gods, in that it doesn't show other gods that God has to battle, that he has to overcome. Instead, it simply starts with God is the one at the top before the beginning. He's the one that created it all. It's a very interesting way to argue because it's clearly understanding the other cultures. So imagine the Jews hearing this for the first time. They notice God already exists, right? It kind of assumes you know what Elohim is, because God here in the Hebrew is Elohim, which is just like a heavenly being. But this specifically is referring to of course, the Elohim of the Elohims. I mean, you see that in Exodus, where God refers to himself as that. Of course, in Genesis, he refers to himself as El Shaddai, which is God Almighty. And so it's not just God Mighty, it's God Almighty. Not that other gods didn't have some of these titles. In fact, I think it was Baal that is called the God of the gods at times. But really, this is interesting because you have God arguing here. Let me just read the rest of this because before I turn the page. The purpose of the Genesis account was not to elevate God to the head of the pantheon. It was to demonstrate that Yahweh stands as the exclusive creator and sovereign ruler of the cosmos. He is to be sharply distinguished from the creation, which, though thoroughly good, is nevertheless not divine. That's interesting to note, that it's like God is clearly very separate. He's holy from his creation. I think that's really important in terms of just theology in general, and that's what Genesis is really trying to show here. Genesis isn't just, it's not trying to give you a scientific account. The point of it could be, actually, I've heard good arguments that Genesis is literally giving you a scientific account. You kind of have to really understand the science deeply in order to get that. And I'm not saying it's not literal, like for instance, the 6-day creation. I actually don't have a personal belief whether it was 6-day or not. But I don't think it's important to not only this conversation, but also I don't think that's necessarily important to Genesis. I truly believe that Genesis is factually an argument against these other gods in a very like, you don't really exist or you really don't have any power. And the reason I mention that is because even in Isaiah, what you see is arguments against people who who fashion their gods and create their gods. I'm not going to read that particularly, but there are instances where God will say they have mouths. Even this is in the Psalms. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. They have noses, but they do not smell. And yet, you still have to have someone fashion that idol. And he says the one that fashions it is like that idol, ultimately mindless and lifeless, because that creator of that idol thinks that that idol is worthy of worship. And it's ridiculous. And so it's God arguing against that idea. This is God's philosophy here. And so I would look that up in the Psalms for sure. But really, I wanted to look at Habakkuk, a passage that I had read recently. It's chapter 3. Going through the minor prophets is fun because I do not do it often. All right, it's Habakkuk's prayer. I'll just read verses 2 through 4, I believe. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. Now, that was verses 2 through 6. And you might first look at that, especially as a 21st century American, and say, wow, that's some very interesting poetry. That's some good imagery. You can kind of picture some of the things going on. But the real question is, what actually is going on here? Now, with any passage in the Bible, you don't want to just necessarily take a verse or take a passage and just read it. It's always good to actually look back and see kind of what's going here. This was approximately 620 BC. The Habakkuk is prophesying a short time before the Babylonian invasions in Judah, which is about 605. So during this time, Assyria controls most of the world. Babylon is still a power, but it's much smaller. It's eventually going to grow, of course, and actually take over Assyria. And it's going to take over Nineveh. But Habakkuk really is a prophecy about the Chaldeans and their power and them coming and the destruction that they are going to bring. Now, of course, Habakkuk has this prayer where he sees God ultimately coming down from this mountain. He says, God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. I guess he came from Teman and the holy Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Now, let's see this. Yes. There's a note for verse 4. This passage is an implicit critique of the common Mesopotamian practice of sun worship. This is interesting because it says in verse 4, his brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. So to continue on, although in many hymns the Babylonians describe Shamash, so this specifically against Babylon, right? He's talking about the Chaldeans coming and their power and them overpowering not just Judah, but also other places as well, like Moab and I believe Moab, and also I think also Samaria and also Edom. And so then although in many hymns, the Babylonians describe Shamash, their god of the sun and of justice, as he who fills the earth with his light. This text stresses that it is in fact the Lord God who does so. Likewise, the Babylonian, Enuma Elish, we talked about that creation myth, describes Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, as covered with radiant splendor, in contrast with the description of the true God in this verse. So this is clearly something against their gods, because God ultimately promises, and he does multiple times, not just through the minor prophets, that even the Assyrians are going to get their judgment, but also the Babylonians. They are going to get their judgment for killing all of these people, especially ruthlessly. It's interesting because God uses them. He uses their evil and greed to take over nations, to ultimately punish people, but then he punishes them on top of that. We know that eventually Persia is going to overtake them, but God kind of, or I guess in this sense, Habakkuk here is really, well, in both senses, God and Habakkuk are describing God coming as light. At least that's how he veils his power, and he's ultimately going to, he's going to bring wrath against Mesopotamia. Is it Mesopotamia? Let's see. Oh no, okay, I was actually wrong about that. So this is not about wrath against the Babylonians. This is actually wrath against these other places, and one of the places mentioned is Kushan, but this is known as Kushu in various Middle Kingdom texts from Egypt, and appears to have been located in the southern Transjordan. So he talks about the judgment coming to these other nations, and especially to Kushan, this supposed Egyptian king, I believe. No. It is just an area. Okay, it's just an area. But the if you guys have read the Bible before and kind of the destruction that Babylon brought, but also if you've read some of history and you understand that Babylon pretty much desecrated all of these lands, and instead of Habakkuk talking about their God kind of like running through the plains and like defeating all of these people and destroying them, and instead it talks about God veiling his power. He's revealing his power, and he is the brightness. Marduk is supposed to be the guy with the brightness, but instead God is. He's ultimately the sun, but he literally is the sun. Like, it's not like you're worshiping the sun. It's that the light of the sun comes from God. He ultimately has that light in himself. That's not to say that you worship the sun, so therefore you're worshiping God, because that's not exactly what this is saying. But what this is trying to say is that light is coming from God, and that his power is being revealed and showed to these people through ultimately their destruction. And that is, in a sense, I wonder if this is written to the Chaldeans, because if they actually read this, then they would see, because this is an argument against their God, that Yahweh is the one true God, and he is the one who is ultimately leading them forth and giving them the strength to conquer these nations. It's not Marduk. It's ultimately Yahweh that is essentially doing this. I think that is a very interesting way to argue, and so I wanted to point that out because, in my opinion, but I think that the facts kind of show it itself, that whenever God is arguing in the Bible, it has this, or whenever God really talks to anyone, I think this is more or less just, I would say, facts probably that, or evidence for the fact that God argues a specific way in Scripture. But I think it also adds to the fact that whenever God is arguing to a specific person or trying to appeal, then he's ultimately going to do it in that person's understanding, language, culture. The Bible, at least in the Old Testament, is originally written in Hebrew. we have the New Testament in Greek. Not that some of it wasn't originally in Hebrew. Some people postulate that it's actually highly possible. Maybe so. Or Aramaic. We don't necessarily know. But Luke, for instance, when he is writing his Greek gospel, and of course also Acts, he's very official. He's very proper. He does it in a very Greek way. And when you actually read it and you also study the difference between Hebrew culture and Greek culture, there is a big difference. And it's more official. It's less metaphorical, and it's still intellectual, but it's in a different level. The philosophy comes in more from you just postulating based on what is literally given, rather than trying to understand what it's trying to say to you, more or less. Luke doesn't really have as much. It's trying to say a specific thing. It's trying to give you an ideology. It's just giving you history. Whereas Matthew, Mark, and especially John is extremely Greek. It's very philosophical, but it has an ideology behind it. It's less about the history. It's more about the point. Same with Matthew and Mark. It's more about the points. It does give history, which I believe Genesis does. I don't know to what degree, but it's specifically trying to give you these points, these arguments against something else, some other ideas, trying to essentially put down those ideas and to falsify them, while also giving you these new claims at the same time, but in a story method, which I can't necessarily say that that is the best way or the worst way. Certainly God would be the one to know, because he actually has the mind for that. But I can tell you this, that whenever God is going to speak to any one of us, it's going to be in the best way possible, because he knows our language, our culture better than anyone else. He knows it better than us. He knows ourselves better than ourselves. This was interesting. I was talking to a coworker actually about this, is that he was talking about a show called Futurama, and it's supposed to be like this super intelligent robot gets like launched into space for some reason, and he ends up like hitting this I don't know if it was a life form or like a space rock that turned into life forms and like started to multiply, and they created this like whole civilization and everything. And he was like God to them, and then he started to interact, but it actually caused problems. It caused like problems for him to do that. And then eventually like God comes in and he's like, hey, you learned something, or like I forget exactly what he said, but and he said, yeah, everything started going wrong once I started interacting. Yeah, that's why I just stay away, or something like that. Now, I don't personally think that. Now, that was a little ideological, but it was a good point. I think that if God does interact, there is going to be, jealousy and issues. I mean, for instance, when Jesus comes in, he gets killed. But I do believe that God does interact. He does care. I don't believe in a deist God. I'm very theistic. And that God actually cares for his creation. And he is the essence of love. He's the source of love. So he is, by definition, going to share that. It's not a necessity as much as just it's who he is. It's in his character. So he is going to do that. It is a necessity of the universe that is going to happen, that he is ultimately going to bring his son. But that also means that in that sense, then he is going to talk to us. I didn't know exactly where I was going with that. I lost some of my train of thought. Usually I'm like taking notes when I do philosophy, but my point is really just that when Jesus is coming as well is also the best possible way to reach the world, if in fact he is God, because God would in fact know the best way, and he would only do the best way because he is the essence of goodness. That's of course that's a lot of layers, but I think it's fairly obvious that in Scripture, God is shown as this character who goes after you as a person. He goes after you and your culture. He understands you. He knows how you argue. He knows how you think. So in that sense, when God withholds himself from a materialistic universe and yet gives us lots and lots of books of evidence, and also Christian philosophers, very intelligent people, lots of intellectuals who are Christians, and uses them to ultimately share Christ. And then he sends missionaries to other countries that aren't necessarily apologetics or philosophers or even theologians, but yet they care a lot. That speaks more to that country and those specific people. I've seen this time and time again. I have heard missionary story after missionary story after missionary story. I have seen the effects of it. I have met missionaries upon missionaries upon missionaries. I'm a pastor's kid. Kind of have to do that. Not exactly, I don't have to, but I want to. And I've also read lots and lots of books of different accounts of just the different ways that God will interact with people. I'd say most people would agree with that, but I think that it's pretty important to today's society that you see that God actually cares in that sense. You can kind of pull that from that idea. I would say, in my opinion, that God does it a lot of times in ways that I don't, or I guess it's not really it is my opinion, but I don't always like the way that God does things, because I wish that it would just be more straightforward. I wish that it would be more obvious. I would say most people in America would want that. But that's why I'm not God. That's why I'm not ruling the universe, because I probably would have ruined it by now. And I'm certain that the rest of us would as well. And I think that's also another point that not just the archaeologists, but also Genesis makes, is that the creation is not God. God and the creation are much different. There is the divine and the very not divine, which would be us as human beings. Of course, I wouldn't say atheism, but humanism, individualism comes from humanism, really kind of really makes you more like God. But of course, that's a different conversation for a different day. Don't want to get off topic too much. I hope that you guys enjoyed kind of some of this. It's very new for me. I have no idea if anyone's really going to watch this or really think about this, but I do think that it is important. It's very thoughtful. Again, if you guys have any comments, please leave those below. God bless you all. Have an amazing day.